Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Resistance from the Right, Conservatives and the Campus Wars in Modern America by Lauren Lassabe Shepherd. Narrated by Emily Durante. I believe that if and when the menace of communism is gone, other vital battles, at present subordinated, will emerge to the foreground, and the winner must have help from the classroom. William F. Buckley, Jr., God and Man at Yale, 1951. Introduction. On an unseasonably cool May 3, 1967, thousands of young people gathered in Hanover, New Hampshire to hear George Wallace, the pro-segregation ex-governor of Alabama and candidate for president, deliver an address to the students and faculty of Dartmouth College. All 1,400 seats of Webster Hall were filled, with an additional 1,000 bystanders gathered outside the hall, tuned in to the campus radio broadcast. But the segregationist's speech was inaudible over boos and shouts of "Wallace, racist" by members of Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, and the Afro-American Society, AAS. White audience members barked back, "Shut up," and goaded the SDS and the AAS to get out. As SDS and AAS members began a walkout, some of the most raucous members of the crowd outside broke past police barricades and entered the auditorium. Hecklers shouted, "Here comes the lynch mob," as students burst into the hall and stormed the center aisle. Alabama state troopers, brought in as reinforcement, whisked Wallace off stage to his getaway vehicle, which was immediately surrounded and assailed by rocks and pounding fists. The commotion was contrived on the speaker's part as much as the audience's. The students wanted a spectacle of dissent. Wallace wanted their spectacle of dissent as a talking point. "They were trying to turn the car over and blow in the top," said the victimized segregationist to a reporter at the Chronicle of Higher Education. "That's academic freedom. That academic freedom will get you killed." Wallace, a man who could strut sitting down, often welcomed hostile activists to his populist rallies. Allowing them to demonstrate first, he would follow with a clever announcement from the stage. "You young people seem to know a lot of four-letter words, but I have two four-letter words you don't know, SOAP and WORK. To a Harvard professor, he once quipped, "If you can't distinguish at Harvard between honest dissent and overt acts of treason, then you ought to come down to Alabama. We'll teach you some law down there." While Wallace's Dartmouth visit was indisputably antagonistic, a minority of voices in the crowd shouted his defense in defiance of AAS and SDS protesters. These students arrived in earnest, eager to hear the presidential candidate notorious for promising segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Shortly after the debacle, a Dartmouth faculty committee voted to suspend the anti-Wallace demonstrators for the remainder of the spring term. That a segregationist was invited to speak at an Ivy League college during the height of the civil rights movement was a curiosity, but it was not exceptional. Wallace's appearance at Dartmouth represents part of a longer story about conservative and right-wing backlash directed at higher education. The right's grumblings that the academy functioned as a breeding ground for anti-Americanism were articulated throughout the 1930s and 1940s by anti-New Deal businessmen lamenting Keynesian economic solutions emanating from the ivory tower. These complaints were perhaps most popularly articulated in the 1950s by students who would become leaders of the post-war conservative movement, William F. Buckley, Jr. and M. Stanton Evans. As Yale students, Bill Buckley and Stan Evans were themselves no strangers to the Ivy League. They were founding members of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, ISI, then called the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists. The organization was created in 1953 by writers at the Freeman and Human Events magazines and bankrolled by the William Volcker Fund as a foil to the Intercollegiate Socialist Society. With Buckley, the enfant terrible of the right, as its first president, ISI functioned as an intellectual bulwark against a perceived liberal indoctrination on American campuses 2 decades before Wallace's invitation to Dartmouth. After leaving Yale, Buckley and Evans each produced book-length polemics condemning the humanist liberal establishment dominated by progressives in America's oldest institutions, whom they dubbed elitists. In God and Man at Yale, The Superstitions of Academic Freedom, 1951, Buckley eloquently chided the university's hypocrisy in soliciting financial contributions from Christian individualists while persuading the sons of these supporters to be atheistic socialists. In Revolt on the Campus, 1961, Evans echoed these charges against socialism, further complaining that the campus was a world in which a student of conservative inclination found himself badly in need of help, counsel, and information. To provide these services, Buckley and Evans designed a second student organization, one with more temerity and punch than the highbrow ISI. Buckley and Evans identified a small group of apprentices ideal for their project. Some were students who were volunteering alongside movement conservatives to draft Barry Goldwater, the cowboy senator from Arizona, as the Republican presidential nominee. Others were fighting to preserve the unpopular anti-communist loyalty oath requirement for recipients of National Defense Education Act funds. Still more were scouted by right-wing faculty, such as law and economics professor Gordon Tullock at the University of South Carolina, who sensed students' distaste for liberalism in their coursework. Buckley shepherded these protégés with their various grievances to his family estate in Sharon, Connecticut in September 1960. Out of this inaugural gathering came the activist youth organization Young Americans for Freedom, YAF. United by strident anti-communism, Christian moralism, and disdain for bureaucracy and planned economies, these student foot soldiers began a movement, under the direction of Buckley and others, to advance a provocative and antagonistic brand of conservatism before their professors and peers. In this context, George Wallace's invitation to Dartmouth, along with more recent lamentations of wokeism and critical race theory, can be understood as a major battle in conservatives' decades-long war against the academy and the cultural changes that liberal education champions. The account that follows tells how right-wing students of the late 1960s, following the guidance of anti-New Deal elders who sponsored them financially and professionally, participated in an AstroTurf mobilization against a so-called liberal establishment in higher education during their time on campus, an era typically associated with the New Left anti-war and Black Power student movements. It describes how young conservatives, who became known as the New Right in the 1970s, used the skills they learned in college to consciously drive American politics and culture further to the authoritarian right, with the Republican Party as their vehicle. These former students include familiar Republican Party officials and strategists, Newt Gingrich, Bill Barr, Jeff Sessions, and Karl Rove. Conservative and right-wing activists better recognized by historians, Pat Buchanan, David Duke, Tom Charles Houston, and Paul Weyrich, and less well-known architects of the nation's anti-democratic political shift, Morton Blackwell, R. Emmett Tyrell, Jr., David Keene, and others. This cohort of movement leaders cut their political teeth as college students engaged in a campus-based struggle against the peace and Black Power movements. When they left college in the 1970s, they represented the Madison Avenue types, who, according to AFL-CIO President George Meany, were trained in mass psychology and propaganda techniques, who have a computerized mailing list, a printing press, and a government-subsidized mailing permit. But the history that follows is not of a vast right-wing conspiracy as Meany implied. Rather, it is about the overt development of a broad network of men and institutions committed to restoring the United States to a pre-existing, even imagined, time when plutocratic white Christians dominated the educational, political, and cultural spheres. Though the movement was chartered and set forth by only a few dozen powerful conservatives, it was not done in secret, quite the opposite. These movement makers have loudly proclaimed their service to the counter-left revolution. They have been prolific writers on the topic of their own success. The reason for this book is that liberals and progressives have generally failed to take the right's self-aggrandizing seriously, at least when it comes to revealing their own inner workings in the academy. This has been to the detriment of not just our public colleges and universities, but our cultural and political spheres more broadly, as the new right has committed to slashing liberal institutional powers to satisfy their preferences and seal their own advantages. Conservatism seeks to maintain social and political conditions that bolster the already powerful. Resistance from the right tells the story of stakeholders in American higher education reacting to challenges to their power from the New Left and Black Power student resistance movements of the late 1960s. This narrative centers the political and cultural right in their pursuit to maintain status quo conditions that, in their perception, benefited them. As we have come to understand conservative backlash against 1960s student activists, familiar stakeholders of the right include college administrators and trustees, politicians, courts, business, church, and community leaders, the National Guard, and the police. This account provides a deeper investigation into another group of campus stakeholders, reactionary college students themselves. During these years, the student right mobilized through traditionalist, libertarian, evangelical, and political campaign groups to join forces with sources of authority to thwart revolution in the academy and punish those who used direct action to bring it about. The organizations of the college right included YAF, ISI, College Republicans, and Campus Crusade for Christ International. By the end of the decade, each of these groups had become to some degree beholden to ideas promoted by YAF. What bound them together through the Vietnam War and Civil Rights era, they claimed, was anti-communism. What they were actually united by was something much less sinister: liberalism. The 1960s student right is usually mentioned in the footnotes of historical studies of the New Left and Black Power movements as part of the collective backlash forces that progressive activists faced. Historical monographs that do attend to the student right have established an important baseline for gauging the identities and activities of conservative youth, but their scope is limited to YAF and ISI alone, with broad coverage of the organization's histories throughout the entire decade of the 1960s and beyond, rather than a focus on their reactionary roles during the late years of the campus wars. These monographs are now over 2 decades old. Providing an updated evaluation, Resistance from the Right considers previously unanalyzed sources to offer a more thorough investigation, while tightening the chronology to spotlight the college right's most combative years. This study also widens the discussion of college conservatism beyond YAF and ISI, incorporating other political, evangelical, libertarian, and white supremacist student groups into a more comprehensive analysis. If general audiences recall the student right during the late 1960s protest era at all, they are usually remembered as a weak, disaffected cadre of reactionaries throwing counterweights at the radicalism inherent in the New Left. YAF is perhaps the only notorious group historians name when mentioning the student right. This is understandably so. As a small and generally ineffective force on their own, conservative students experienced real power only when they enhanced and elevated the voices of existing authorities. But the student right's relative weakness, in comparison to the student left, ironically became an efficiency once these young people understood that they did not need to be popular to wield power. So long as they tapped into existing channels of authority, winning over their peers was not necessary to achieve their desired ends. This understanding was formative in developing the New Right's organizing techniques, not just during their time on campus, but for the rest of their careers as the next generation of movement leaders. They understood that democracy presented a challenge to their unpopular positions in favor of the Vietnam War and against social justice causes. But they also realized that in a democratic system, the illusion of popularity remained essential. Conservative baby boomers thus discovered that they needed only to appear popular, to claim to represent a youth-silent majority, or to cast doubt on the legitimacy of actual majorities, while relying on external powers to uphold structures that privileged them. In the context of national backlash to the New Left and Black Power movements, the collegiate right internalized how existing power structures functioned, then used this understanding to shape the conservative movement they would carry forth from within the Republican Party. This book complicates our understanding of right-wing backlash as populist, since the narrators within were college students at a time when higher education was inaccessible to most. The inclusion of Ivy League and other elite institutions throws this dynamic into even further relief. It challenges assumptions of conservative backlash as grassroots by exploring the students' impressive financial support. The right's campus mobilization was less an organic youth endeavor than a top-down directive from funding giants in the larger movement, primarily leaders associated with the Foundation for Economic Education, the Mont Pelerin Society, and writers at National Review, Modern Age, Human Events, Commentary, and Public Interest magazines. Major benefactors included Harold Luno of the William Volcker Fund, businessman Charles Koch, former New Jersey Governor Charles Edison, banking and oil magnate Richard Mellon Scaife, philanthropist Henry Salvatori, and others connected through direct mail operations by fundraisers Marvin Liebman and Richard Viguerie. In addition to funding, young conservatives received regular mentorship and direction from elders such as Buckley, Goldwater, Ronald Reagan, William Rusher, Strom Thurmond, and a host of other prominent white male writers, politicians, evangelical leaders, segregationists, and anti-communist conspiracists. Since graduating college in the early 1970s, many former members of the student right, including all 56 participants interviewed in this study, have populated the academy, the legal system, politics, the media, think tanks, state and federal agencies, and private industry, serving as economic, political, and cultural influencers. They willingly share that throughout their professional careers, they have purposefully expanded their ideological influence to guarantee an enduring resistance to liberalism in whatever arena they hold power. The New Right's coalition of former Yaffers, college Republicans, and ISI students have gone on to found think tanks, operate and fundraise through political action committees, and exercise their organizational talents to bring new constituents, including the religious right, into the Republican Party. For decades, these alumni have trained new generations to elevate traditionalist and libertarian grievances in United States politics and have relentlessly waged culture wars to return to what they consider more desirable social and economic conditions of the past. Understanding how the New Right was educated and how they continue to work as activists is not just important to anyone studying the history of the Republican Party, American conservatism, or social movements more broadly. It is fundamental to studying higher education. The people discussed here are not just former college students. They are powerful present-day leaders who have dedicated their careers to fundamentally reshaping liberal higher education, including college founders, college presidents, faculty of various disciplines, and leaders of educational think tanks and youth activist training organizations. Other alumni included in this study work outside higher education, but have nonetheless held influence over education policy, including 2 former attorneys general, members of Congress, White House staffers spanning the Nixon to Trump administrations, federal judges, conservative lobbyists and advisors, members of conservative media and advising enterprises, lawyers, activists, and others who view liberalism in the academy as a problem deserving intense scrutiny and sanction. To construct a narrative of the campus wars from the conservative perspective, Resistance from the Right looks to oral histories from former college students, representing YAF, ISI, college Republicans, ROTC programs, and other groups, and their mentors. Most of the interviews were conducted in participants' homes and workplaces, at the 2018 annual meeting of the Philadelphia Society in Fort Worth, Texas, at meetings of the Liberty Fund in Indianapolis, Indiana in 2018, and Chicago, Illinois in 2019. At an alumni reunion during the 2019 Conservative Political Action Conference in Oxon Hill, Maryland, and virtually in 2020. My own interviews are supplemented with transcripts of interviews with YAF mentors, including William F. Buckley Jr., William Rusher, and Richard Viguerie, conducted by historian Gregory L. Schneider between 1994 and 1997. The nearly 6 interviews are enhanced by archival collections from the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and the Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon Presidential Libraries, news coverage from the Chronicle of Higher Education, the New York Times, and regional and community print journalism, chapter artifacts from public and private university special collections nationwide, and the personal collections of memorabilia and literature offered by interview participants. The story unfolds chronologically from 1967 to 1970, the peak of the campus wars, to show how the collegiate right adapted and enhanced its strategies for countering the left over the course of a few years. Though this is not an exhaustive list of their endeavors, it illustrates the general perspectives, motives, interests, and behaviors of conservative students of the baby boomer generation. Their activities as college students not only informed their future politics and the future character of the Republican Party, but also gave shape to subsequent policies, precedents, and laws that limit perceived progressivism in the academy today. This book is organized thematically into 2 parts. Part 1, Coalition Building, broadly tells of the student rights efforts to mobilize, with guidance and funding from older mentors who supported their fight to shield the campus from changes demanded by peace and civil rights activists. It offers a comprehensive examination of the student rights decision to transition from the promotion of conservative ideas to reactionary resistance against their political foils as college conservatives defined what it meant to act like an American, placing anti-war and racial justice activists outside the definition. Chapter 1 situates the academy in the context of national politics, discusses contemporary student demographics, and introduces the ideological contours of the student right. An examination of federal funding for institutional military research explains faculty and administrative imperatives to repress anti-war dissent. This chapter is most helpful to those with an interest in the 1960s landscape of higher education. Chapter 2 explores the conservative rationale for balancing the academy through right-wing educational nonprofits. These nonprofits, especially ISI, offered seminars and free literature to equip students with traditionalist counterarguments in their classes. ISI and other organizations provided generous fellowships to ensure a continuous conservative pipeline into the professorate. Detailed instruction manuals from movement elders and specially crafted press releases directly from the Nixon administration guided the students in creating content for alternative campus newspapers and radio programs. Chapter 3 chronicles YAF executives' efforts to make student conservatism appear more widespread to support their claim that the right represented a campus majority. An exploration of the backlash to peace demonstrations in the fall of 1967 and support for war industry recruitment demonstrates how the right's independent attempts to organize were initially disjointed and inefficient. Organizing broadly around the principle of anti-communism, which meant anti-liberalism, helped groups like YAF reach new constituencies. This chapter further covers students' appropriation of New Left slogans and symbols and discusses how the guise of humor helped conceal white supremacy. Finally, it details how the right strategically captured moderate college Republican clubs and student government associations. Chapter 4 details conservative mobilization against anti-war and civil rights demonstrators at Columbia University in the spring of 1968 and the anti-leftist Majority Coalition organizational model that emerged in its aftermath. Under this model, the leading conservative group abandoned its multiple objectives, as outlined in the Sharon Statement, to reorganize around the singular idea of stopping the New Left. This model was revolutionary and became a fundamental part of the right's mobilization thereafter. Part 2, Law, Order, and Punishment, elaborates the transition in student focus from recruitment to demands for punishment and, in some instances, violence against their opponents. It also demonstrates how the vanguard conservative club YAF fully committed to the singular aim of resisting an ill-defined left to attract new recruits under the banner of a unified student silent majority. Chapter 5 analyzes student participation in campaigns for law and order and segregationist Republican Party presidential nominees throughout the fall of 1968. Chapter 6 explores the backlash against civil rights demands and calls for Black Studies programs and departments in 1969. These two chapters most fully explore how resistance to racial justice was inherent to college conservatism during these years, though it is a theme that recurs throughout the book. Chapter 7 recounts the censure and expulsion of libertarians from YAF for pointing out common ground with the New Left on certain issues related to conscription, civil rights, and police brutality. It demonstrates how ideologically students on the right chose whatever rhetorical defenses they needed to protect traditionalist values and were willing to exile long-standing members who challenged these inconsistencies. In response, traditionalists expanded their outreach among other students by enthusiastically supporting campus athletics against the New Left charge that contact sports were a proxy for war. Chapter 8 explores conservative defenses of the Vietnam War and campus ROTC programs. YAF's nationwide Freedom Offensive campaign encouraged students to become legally and physically assertive in anticipation of leftist demonstrations by threatening lawsuits against their college's trustees and students while goading radicals into physical altercations. Chapter 9 analyzes the right's support for the invasion of Cambodia and the massacre of Kent State University students in the spring of 1970. It also examines the right's lawsuits designed to force institutions to remain open during campus strikes, demonstrating the movement's willingness to use the courts to bend administrators to their political will. In these years, radical demands for peace and racial justice emboldened the student right to challenge progressives' claim of majority representation, reframe their arguments, and focus on the left's less respectable tactics to create suspicion around campus anti-war and civil rights initiatives. Through alliances with powerful figures of the larger conservative movement and corporate sponsors who delivered, among other things, financial support and the assurance of legal, physical, or carceral punishment against their adversaries, campus conservatives harnessed multiple forces to ensure a battery of checks against progressivism in the academy. Over the past several decades, alumni of these groups and other
Sample complete. Ready to continue?